Okay, the shot clock has started, which means we will get started on our panel discussion. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. I'm Jennifer Bradley with the Center for Urban Innovation at the Aspen Institute. The work of the center occurs at the intersection between innovation and inclusion in cities. How can cities innovate to be more opportunity-rich places for all of their residents? And how can they prioritize innovations that lean into equity? I'm really excited about this panel about land use planning for equity over the long term. Before I was an urbanist, I was an English major. And so I'm really taken by the idea that equity has more than one meaning. That land use has been used to support a kind of financial equity for some communities and to destroy that kind of financial equity for other communities. And now we're thinking about land use in a broader sense of equity as a sense of opportunity and giving people what they need to flourish. So we have a spectacular panel. We have Professor Sheila Foster from Georgetown University, Anika Goss, the Executive Director of Detroit Future City, and Paul Mogush, the Manager of Community Planning at the City of Minneapolis. They have very impressive biographies. I invite you to look at the app so you can learn more about them, but for now we're going to use our time more for discussion. Another interesting thread about this panel is we're looking at land use planning in three different frames. There's a more traditional city land use planning process. There's a land use planning process that takes place outside the city in a think and do tank. And then there's a kind of radical democratic process that Sheila will talk about that is incredibly community-centered without a particular time horizon, but kind of a regular infusion of democracy. So I think that scoping will be something that will enliven the discussion as well. So Paul, as the more traditional practitioner, although I know your process unfolded in a pretty new and participatory way, how does equity play out in your work in Minneapolis?
Well, first, we started with a traditional process. So the process that I'm talking about is a comprehensive planning process for our whole city, something that we do every 10 years under state statute. When we started this time, which was 3 years ago in 2016, we were looking at the situation in our city and seeing that while around the country, we in Minneapolis, we get a lot of attention for being a great place to live. We have all these Fortune 500 companies. People are very economically successful. That isn't really the whole story. We actually have some of the worst, most profound racial disparities in the country in Minneapolis when it comes to income, when it comes to education, when it comes to health outcomes. So when we started this traditional planning process, we said to ourselves as the planners, we think it's really important to figure out a way to use land use planning to help close those gaps and to advance racial equity. And then we went to our elected officials and they said, you know, we think we need to use this land use planning process to close these gaps. And then we went to the community, and without even us asking them, the community said to us, hey, let's use this land use planning process as a way to help close these racial gaps. So that's where I come at this question. I can talk a lot more later about what we did, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Great. Anika, tell us about how Detroit Future City is trying to create a more equitable, literally map of Detroit.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's really interesting because the way you described it as planning from the public sector perspective and then planning as a private sector, Detroit Future City is most well known for the Detroit Strategic Framework that was developed, and over 100,000 Detroiters participated in long-range land use and economic development planning in Detroit at a time when Detroit was at its lowest economically and in terms of public infrastructure as well. So it was right after, in 2010, between 2010 and 2013, right after the recession. The idea of long-range visioning seemed incomparable at the time, but what we realized was how important it was for Detroiters to have a voice in what the future of their city would look like. I think now that Detroit Future City is an independent nonprofit and serving as a think tank and planning organization in Detroit, independent of the city, and Detroit itself has changed so much since that time. It's really critical for us to think about inclusive growth and equitable opportunity for all of the Detroiters that are there. So I'm excited to engage in the conversation this morning.
So Sheila, how is equity turning up in your CoCity work?
Yeah, so hi. We have at labgov.city, which is an international research laboratory that I run and have worked in many cities in Europe and South America and also here in the US, have created a model called the CoCity model, which is really a co-creation model, a collaboration model, in which we put communities in the center from the beginning of planning, along with other actors, including public actors, private actors, institutional actors. And so the way I think about it is coming from a long history of environmental justice activism. I spent a lot of my career in the environmental justice movement. And much like the environmental mainstream movement, land use frameworks often put equity or justice off to the side, right? Which is to say, and so that's the first thing I would say is that if what you're doing is you're regulating the environment or you're planning on land use and then equity's over here, right? All of a sudden, already you're creating a tension or almost a dichotomy between what's the framework,
The real process.
and then what is this thing over here. So we've designed kind of this CoCity model where we've been working in various cities from Bologna in Italy to Baton Rouge now to Harlem to start with equity, right? To go to the communities, figure out where the anchor institutions are, who's left out of those, and then to bring them together with what we call our 5-actor model, right? That innovation comes from not public-private, not even public-private community, but rather public-private knowledge actors, social innovators, and others to bring about the kind of change, equitable change that we want to see in our communities.
So one of the things that your response tees up is this idea of equity as both an outcome, but also as a process. So talk a little bit about how equity is enacted as a process in the CoCity work, and then we'll run that through the panel.
So we have what we call a project cycle, and the first step of the cycle is what we call cheap talking, right? So, which is that we create forums. So in Baton Rouge, for instance, in Louisiana, food is very important to the culture there and to communities. So one way into figuring out what folks' needs are and what their lived experience are, let's have a food fair, right? Where people bring food or you gather food trucks. You create opportunities for low stakes talking or low stakes checking in before surveys, before formal participatory processes, in part to build trust. Because if you want to work in communities in which there's a long history, particularly in this country, of urban renewal, of mistrust, of redevelopment and land use processes, you've got to start rebuilding that trust. And then you bring other actors. And so we have a whole project cycle which goes through cheap talking, mapping, then practicing, then prototyping, putting in place, and then testing. And we do that in all cities, and it's very adaptive, and it just looks differently. But I would say from the very beginning, if you're putting in the center of the process the people that you're trying to serve, then, and it's as low stakes as possible, then for us, that's really the entry point.
So Anika, you talked about 100,000 Detroiters, which is a huge percentage of the city's population being engaged in the Detroit Future City process. How have you maintained that level of resident engagement? Right, because a crisis, bankruptcy or recession can galvanize people, but it's that enduring showing up. So how does that continue to play out in Detroit Future City?
I wish I could say that we invite 100,000 people to my office once a week for a community meeting, but we don't. But we do in a couple of different ways. So part of the outcome of this was actually opening a storefront, right? So we have a storefront at DFC in the middle of town that's really easy to get to. And we invite people to come in on a regular basis. So at a very sort of baseline level, that's how we are engaging the broad public. However, now that we spend more time around, we're more of a traditional nonprofit and we provide technical assistance and re-granting for land use and community gardens. But one of the most important things I think that we do to engage is we issue a lot of data reports. But as opposed to just issuing those reports about what's happening in Detroit, how Detroit is growing, we actually invest an inordinate amount of time at community meetings and block club meetings and inviting people in and going out in the community talking about these reports. And so what we're finding is being able to create these reports in a way that's accessible for all Detroiters. So people are engaged in the information, they're understanding the data, they're understanding how they can use the data, so they're not just reading about what's happening to them when new investment is happening and comes to town, but they can actually still have a voice in what happens, what they agree with, what they don't agree with.
So say a little more about the decisions that you're teeing up communities to be able to make.
Right. So a lot of them end up being around land use. So which is what's happening in Detroit right now, right? It's a huge real estate play because much of Detroit, while the downtown and the 7 miles surrounding downtown is being developed very, very quickly, which is making everyone really, really anxious at how quickly it's redeveloped. The rest, it's creating this donut of disinvestment. Where the rest of the city is still really, really struggling. However, the other side of that struggle is that real estate is really cheap in those areas. And so as we continue to be a partner in those communities, because, along with the real estate having increased investment, the city, the real estate environment all have increased capacity that they didn't have before, right? And so we really do see our role in this way of helping residents understand the real estate development process, understand the kind of voice that they have in their own communities, understand even the kinds of, not everything has to be a pushback or a hold up, but to be really clear about what it is that they want to see in their own neighborhoods and that's okay. Like, okay, so maybe you're not gonna get the Neiman Marcus that you were expecting in your neighborhood right now. However, there's a lot of other things that could happen, and this is how Neiman Marcus even makes decisions about whether or not they're coming into a city, right? That you need to be able to understand it at that level. And that's how we've been partnering and engaging with communities. And I know I'm going on long, but I want to just say this one last thing. One of the things that we've been paying a lot more attention to and helping people to really, really understand in Detroit, because Detroit is it's the largest standing African American city. At 80% of the population is still African American. So that for us, the narrative for that we want people to understand is that African Americans in a city like Detroit is a value proposition. That this is an opportunity to think about Detroit and the African Americans that live there as a way for us to grow economically and equitably and inclusively. And so that's been a lot of how we've been engaging residents in Detroit right now.
Great. Paul, talk about what the process was by which you got to a more equitable plan.
Sure, we did both sides of it. You're talking about the process side and the substance side. On the process side, we were very intentional to not reach out to just the usual suspects in a planning process. The people who already have agency and access to the government are going to show up, no matter what we in the bureaucracy do, no matter how we set the table. So of course, we let them do their thing and their voices were heard. But where we focused our time and our resources and our energy were in bringing in folks to the process who wouldn't otherwise be likely to be engaged. So we found tables that already exist out in the community and went to them. We went to specific cultural groups and other organizations like people with disabilities and seniors and so on. And just like Sheila was talking about, we started the trust building process by asking we didn't come in and say, hey, here's what we're up to, what do you think? We asked them what they're working on, what their organizations are working on. That helped us understand what's going on in our city, to inform the planning process, and it started to build that trust process, or to build trust with those communities. And then we brought it out to the whole community and started asking really open-ended questions about what people's values are and how they see the future of the city, what their dreams are for the future of the city. So then we could later go back and reflect back what we heard. And just to get to some of the substance, what we heard was there were three main priorities that people had. One, racial equity, as I mentioned. Two, access to affordable housing and just choice, the matter of choice in housing. And three, combating climate change through land use and transportation planning. Those were the three very clear priorities. But another thing that was really important to do on the racial equity side of things was to do some education for ourselves as planners and for our community, and owning up to the role that planners have played in the past around the country and in Minneapolis in particular in some of those issues that Jennifer was talking about in the opening about how land use has closed off, land use planning has closed off access to parts of the city. So we did a whole series of education events on racially restrictive covenants, on redlining, lending practices, and the role of zoning in working together with those racially restrictive housing policies to keep people of color out of white neighborhoods. And when you look at the maps of today, the demographic maps in 2019, there is a long-lasting legacy of those practices, the places where people of color were excluded from getting mortgages by redlining maps, where there were racially restrictive covenants in deeds, and where we have single-family zoning are still the whitest parts of the city. So that was part of the process that we took people through.
One of the things that's come up in your conversation, in your point, is this notion of capacity building, right? So, Anika, you built capacity through information. Paul, you talk about capacity not in terms of other folks in the neighborhood, but in terms of what a planner, a planner's own understanding and capacity about their job. Anika, why is that capacity building? Why is it important to make sure that the community has capacity?
Right tools. Yeah, we have found that is a critical decision. And I think one of the things that we've learned over time is, and I think when we were on our prep for this, I had said that in 2013, everyone was struggling in Detroit. We were all in the same terrible city boat, right? Like our city was really struggling and we were all trying to figure out how to make it better. What we couldn't have anticipated was how quickly the city would change, and there were people who could change with it because they had the resources, but a whole lot of people who couldn't change with it because they didn't understand what was happening so quickly, right? And so I think that's an important lesson for a lot of cities. Over time, as you look at how cities changed and where that information lies and who has the resources to change with the city, not everybody, and I'm not saying that the city has to be split up in equal parts, but I think too often in cities we make decisions about where investments go and make assumptions about communities that people will be glad that something is there because nothing was there before. right? As opposed to really having that engagement early on about what people want their neighborhood to look like. And I'm just going to give one quick example. There's one neighborhood in Detroit on the east side that's in a really, where there's a high level of vacant land. During a period of time when there wasn't a lot of investment, that neighborhood, those residents, really took the time with their local community development corporation, with us at Detroit Future City and other land use and sustainability groups to train and help people understand the importance and value of open space in their own neighborhood. So they began a process of valuing the vacant land and turning that land into productive land themselves, right? And then when there began more momentum from other investors and from the city about what should happen in that neighborhood, they really pushed back. Because what they quickly realized is that even though new investment was coming into their neighborhood, they were then going to lose the trees, the bioretention that they had built that was helping them manage stormwater, the gardens that they had planted. All of those things are really important and assets to building neighborhoods as well.
So Sheila, you talk about, particularly in this kind of radical democracy experiment, about building capacity because folks like you won't always be able to be there. So how does that work? How do you infuse that capacity?
So I just want to pick up on what Anika said, which is to say that there are assets in communities already, right? And so it's really important whether they're communities that have built gardens or farming, or whether they're strong kind of community-based organizations. And so when we talk about capacity, you know, we have to put on two hats, right? On the one hand, one of the questions I've always gotten asked is, well, you want more democracy in these communities, more community participation, but aren't these folks poor? They work 2 jobs. They don't have time to go to. And so we can't think that way about these communities, right? I mean, there's social network and capital and work being done in these communities that we have to build on. On the other hand, these communities are under-resourced, right? And so at the same time as recognizing the assets, we have to bring in resources. And whether it's the knowledge sector, universities, or whether it's private, small businesses, private actors. So the way we work with cities, and it's always with cities or city agencies, but yet we bring a model that says first we go into community, and then we figure out how to bring other actors to the table with resources, something we call pooling, right? You gotta pool to bring the right actors to bolster the assets that the community has, and then to help communities also connect with other actors that because of racial stratification and economic isolation, they may not be connected to these actors. So for me, that's part of capacity building. That's part of the equity in the model. And all of this is contextual, right, and adaptive. It doesn't look the same in Detroit as it does in Baton Rouge or Harlem, or Amsterdam where we're working, or Costa Rica. It just looks differently. But part of it is that you have to contextually be thinking about equity in place and thinking about. And so in our project cycle, the reason to engage in cheap talking and then mapping is to map the assets to figure out what is happening in this city and the relationship between different communities. I'll give one other example. I just spent 3 years on the mayor's panel on climate change in New York City. And one thing the mayor did was put equity in the middle of the work and said, look at climate change through the lens of equity at the neighborhood level. And I co-chaired the group of equity on that panel. And what we did is the first thing I did was to bring 3 community-based organizations to the panel, to this expert panel with climate scientists from the Bronx, from South Brooklyn, from Harlem. These organizations that have already been working on climate justice. Why are we having a conversation without them at the table? And so, and our work proceeded as such in the final report after 3 years with equity, how we do equity in a big city like New York around climate has them as co-authors, co-creators of that framework.
So Paul, the comprehensive plan takes place every 10 years. What do you do with the community engagement that you have fostered? Does it go dormant for 10 years? What do you do to stay engaged? And what do you do as planners to maintain that sense of urgency? Because it's so easy, right? You have an experience, you go through racial equity training or something, And that's a day compared to a decade or more of professional experience that says we're experts and this is what good work looks like and we don't want to be squishy. So how do you keep that transformation both in community and then just day to day in your office?
Right, we can't let it, we put too much time and effort into it to let it just go away after 3 years of intense work in the community. A lot of it is following up with capacity building to this discussion from before. So the land use plan is, the title of this session is leveling the playing field. So the land use plan for the whole city is really just that. It's just leveling, the way we view it is we're leveling the playing field. But of course, when you're talking about equity as opposed to equality, leveling the playing field isn't nearly enough. You have to make conscious and targeted investments where they're needed the most in order to actually achieve equitable outcomes. One thing that we're doing as we shift from the planning phase to the implementation phase is those of us in our long-range planning group that I lead, we're starting to lend ourselves out to specific geographic communities who want to do some more strategic implementation work. So we're facilitating tables where it's not really the city saying what should happen, but bringing people together in the community to start laying out on paper for themselves how they see the broader goals laid out in the comprehensive plan for the city playing out in their local communities. That requires a lot of capacity building that hasn't happened yet. There are a lot of our more vulnerable communities that don't have, say, community development corporations on the ground doing that work. So part of that is also maybe approaching foundations and seeding some of that work in the community. But most important for us in the bureaucracy, it's seeding some control and making sure that the work is really seeding.
CED. You seed SEED capacity
I
and you
used the word in
seed
both
CEDE control. Yeah.
Thank you for
Right.
It's hard. Very confusing. Equity, seed.
Yep.
So one of the things that is interesting. Excuse me. Sorry, I'm going to have to take a drink. How do you deal with the issue as you're negotiating this of equity fatigue? There was a report that my colleagues at Brookings did in the early 2000s about Minneapolis, St. Paul, called Mind the Gap, that really brought to mind, that really highlighted this notion of racial gaps in across all kinds of factors. Then in 2012, 13, I went back to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and did another report that said, yep, still there, still big. How do you keep the community engaged, both the community that has been advocating for equity and the community that's like, oh God, haven't we done enough, right? Like, didn't we just do this plan? We're kind of equitied out. How do you keep fatigue from setting in?
There's a lot of ways. One is for those of us who are white in our community to keep talking to our white friends and family members and neighbors about this. And if they're fatigued, I don't know. We're still going to keep talking about it. I don't know what to say to them about that. And another is, something that I think we suffer from is there is a lack of a sense of urgency, I think, in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities in general. The crisis that we're facing isn't immediately apparent to everybody. It's not as visible, say, as what happened in Detroit, and we haven't seen this. We don't have 100,000 people talking about this, and we don't have an organization like yours that's really at the forefront. And I wish we did. So. Anybody in Minneapolis who's listening, if you want to start something like that, please do. Get on it. Yeah.
Anika, how do you combat equity fatigue, again, both from the point of view of communities with high expectations and communities that are maybe not super excited about going farther?
We have not had equity fatigue. That has not been the issue. The conversation, that's not the problem. The problem that I think that we often come across is people not under the term equity being overused, right? And so at different tables, people wanting to participate, and that aren't necessarily accustomed to participating. We have a lot of organizations and businesses and companies that are from other cities that are coming in and saying, oh, we want this to be equitable, but then they don't really understand what that means. Like they just assume that, equity means I'm telling you that what I'm about to do. And so because you know that, now that's equitable. And it's like, no, that's not what that means. So that has been more of I think, the challenge for us right now, and that's something that we're like in real time talking about. How do we actually align what everybody means by equity, especially economic equity? I mean, that's what we're focused on, and I think people are, and I think that that's okay that people want to be able to focus on all of the different elements of equity, whether it's racial equity or economic equity or environmental equity. I think it's okay for all of us to be able to lead in different ways on that. But I do think it's really important that we continue to push on what we're actually talking about. And that's our real challenge in Detroit.
Yeah, Sheila, how did either aspect of this question,
Right.
either the fatigue or the definitional creep.
So
play
we
out
don't
with you?
use the term equity in part because, instead we just do equity, right? I mean, so there's a point at which, so language is important, and certainly it's important to name things and to talk about structural inequality, et cetera, and that's certainly part of, the minute you go to communities, that's gonna come up, right? But we don't lead with equity in the way because of all of the reasons we talked about. Instead, we try to do the work and figure out the incentive structure to bring resources to this community. And sometimes, unfortunately in the society, people turn off when they think you're guilting them. And while I don't want to play to that necessarily, to be conscious of the fact that, that simply saying certain words, right, going in like that, right, may, number one, raise more questions than answers, and that's partly what we're talking about. Well, what do you mean by equity? What does that mean in the context of this project? So I think it's important for more people to do equity, to figure out what it means, both as a process and outcome, and also to speak in terms that really get resources to communities. I mean, that really is the bottom line. At the end of the day, there are so many needs, and our processes at the city level are falling so short for so many communities that I guess I'm just not that interested in talking about it anymore and figuring out how to pitch it right, but simply to go in and do it. And to the credit of cities like Detroit and Minneapolis, there are people in the city and outside that just want to do it and get down to that work. So whatever moves the ball for me works. That's where I am in my career. Whatever moves the ball, wherever gets it done. And by that I mean, getting resources to these communities.
I think you looked like you had something to say about that or follow. Well, one of the things that we talked about on the prep call is that I think everybody goes into this work knowing that it will be hard, but there are still some things that turn out to be hard that are surprising. And you had a compelling story about how there was a surprise difficulty in Detroit. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think maybe that it was the unevenness that came out of I think, and it's something that we're still dealing with, is that, and I think I shared a little earlier that I think what was so surprising for us was how people were not going to be able to participate in the same way once the planning was complete. And when you go through a planning process that feels so inclusive, especially if you've included what feels like everybody, 100,000 people in a city of, at the time, was only 500,000, feels like just about everybody. And for then, after that entire process, for then people to then still feel like it wasn't done well, it didn't represent them, it didn't represent their voice, was really, really disappointing. And not only that, it was really nice of you to say, oh, we wish we had a DFC there, but it took us a long time to get to where we are now, because at that moment, I don't think that we were prepared as an organization, institutionally, to carry the weight of the long-range 50-year vision of 100,000 people. And that, I think that, whether you're and this is the whole point of the session, of this long-term equity conversation, who is going to carry that water long-term? And do they have the institutional wherewithal, the knowledge, the community credibility, the context to be able to carry that water for the next 50 years? I really see my role at Detroit Future City at the very early end. We're only a 3-year-old nonprofit. We'll be 4 years in January, right? So we're very young. The time that I am here now is to build the institutional foundation so that 20 years from now, Detroit Future City is still here, and it's still a repository of information. It's still doing the same thing, and it's able to change as the city continues to change. But you have to, being willing to admit that you're not ready to carry the voices of 100,000 people early on is a really hard pill to swallow, I think.
Paul, what's been unexpectedly hard? And then I'll give you an additional question. What was easier than you thought?
On the hard part, it's a good news, bad news thing. So it is always. The good thing is that we now have really strong buy-in for this policy direction that we're taking from our community, and most importantly, most notably, from our elected officials, our city council and our mayor. That's raising the expectations about what we can deliver. That's good, because we need to deliver on that. It's also really challenging. It is urgent. There's a lot we need to do now. There's a lot of, frankly, just pressure on staff to deliver a lot of things really quickly, like inclusionary zoning and tenant protections, and figuring out how to fund transit improvements in the places where they're needed most, and so on and so forth. I've been a planner for a while now, and I've done a lot of plans. I've never seen this level of buy-in. It's what we've always wished for as planners, that people would pay attention to the work we do. So it's great, but it's a lot of work too, but it's a good problem to have. The thing that was easier, that surprised me, is we discovered there were a lot of people in the community waiting to have this conversation. So they showed up, new advocacy organizations formed around these issues, and really made their case to their elected officials that this was important. That surprised me and was wonderful.
And for people who don't know, can you just explain the kind of headline around the process, which was a pretty significant, I'll use a strong word, incursion into the tradition of single-family zoning?
Right, yeah, we moved a lot of people's cheese with this. It was an incursion. But the headline is that we're ending single-family zoning in Minneapolis. About something like 50% of our city has been zoned for single-family for decades and decades, really typical of cities around the country. The New York Times did a really cool analysis of a whole bunch of cities around the country that shows maps of where their single-family zoning is, so you can kind of see how that varies from city to city. But we did a lot more than that I'm proud of, but that's been the big headline around the country, is that we ended single-family zoning.
Yeah, and so to put a lot of buy-in plus ending single-family zoning is kind of an extraordinary thing. So Sheila, I'll flip the question again for you. What's been easier than you thought it would be in the LabGov CoCities movement?
I think the political willingness to do something has been easier, not nearly as much resistance from the people in power, so to speak. So that's been great. Which is to say, one reason why we started in European cities is because during the economic crisis, there was just a lot of willingness to try innovative things, try something new. So when we drafted regulation in Bologna, in which the city could enter into pacts of collaboration with communities and other actors to regenerate and to transfer resources to them, whether it's building or money, that was remarkably easy. Not just because of where the city was in its tradition, but also because of where the country was. And then as we moved around to cities, it just seems that there's more willingness. And now that we're in the U.S. doing this, I'm struck, so we're working in Baton Rouge, which is a tough environment politically in many respects, but it's a tale of two cities, and they want to now do something about that, right? So we're working in the, in a corridor that is African American, very poor, left behind, and they're going to run a rapid line, to connect them. And predictably, that part of the city will be gentrified. So putting in place structures to keep people in place and to make sure that the community, and for me this is important, our stewards, long after we're gone in our professional roles, what are you leaving behind? I'm always thinking about that. And the community have got to be stewards of economic revitalization. And if they're not, then when we leave, are they pushed out? Are they benefiting from all of the planning, the wonderful planning that cities are doing? So that's really what's driving the model. And that, to me, is the hard part, is, if the community needs housing, would a land trust work here in which community members are on the board and they're stewarding this long term? Are there other institutional mechanisms in which you give communities power to reap the benefits of everything that's coming to their community? And so that's a lot of what we're doing substantively on the innovation front, is designing those kind of frameworks and institutions. Because I think it's important, that stewardship model, if the city is ours, we have a right to be here. How do we make sure people stay and benefit?
So one of the things that's kind of awesome about this panel is we've been talking about land use and equity for 40 minutes, and we haven't used my least favorite word, and it starts with G and ends with gentrification. But that does go to, because I think often we use gentrification as a word to say, I don't like what's going on, but we don't necessarily specify what is the what, and therefore it becomes a policy solution becomes elusive if you don't know what the real problem is. But that word, the G word, does call into question who is community. And in a place like Detroit that has people who have stuck with that city through thick and thin, and then a bunch of people who are drawn there because of the sense of opportunity, adventure, to participate in the remaking or the extension of a great American place, what does community look like, and how do you engage new and old in these discussions around equity?
Wow, when you get the
easy
answer
question.
to that, let
Right.
me know.
I'll be rich.
It's, because it's.
We'll have a
it's
whole
tough.
conference on that.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's a whole panel.
Because so Detroit Future City is releasing a report next week. And the idea of how it's a consumer survey of Detroit residents and how they feel about redevelopment and whether or not they have actually experienced displacement or they're just afraid of displacement. And all of that is under the rubric of gentrification, right? This fear of displacement. So what we learned is that about 46% of Detroiters feel fear of displacement. Only 6% have actually been displaced. Only 12% have been, on the verge of being displaced, where something is going in and they just haven't left yet, right? So it's a really small number of people who've actually had to move. But this idea, 46% are really anxious about what's happening in and around their neighborhood. And even if it's not in their own neighborhood, they're watching it happen in other parts of the city that they comfortably went to before, but now they don't feel so comfortable going to. And that's also called gentrification, right?
Exactly.
And so this is an issue for us in Detroit that we've never had to deal with in this way since segregation was actually the law in Michigan, where you were allowed to keep people out. And how we deal with it as a city where everyone feels comfortable wherever they are, whether you're a restaurant, whether you're a new bar, whether you're a small business, is the priority right now of how we're talking about redevelopment. I like to say that having that really uncomfortable conversation about how you how you enter a neighborhood as a new resident, no matter what you look like or where you're from, should be intentional. You should be intentional about how you come into this neighborhood because there are people who were living there before you. And so I think this is something that this is real time for us that's happening. But I mean, I think we haven't gotten to the point yet in Detroit where you're like in other cities where, whole Section 8 buildings are being cleared out for high income, high market. All development in Detroit, any development, whether it's downtown, skyscraper, whatever, it's all subsidized. There is nothing in Detroit right now that's being developed. That is a quote. There is nothing in Detroit that's being developed right now that doesn't have some level of subsidy. So now is the time for us to plan for what inclusive growth looks like.
Paul, how did you guys deal with with both the actual data around displacement, but also this sense of fear that change in neighborhoods will continue patterns of disadvantage that have been, existent, as we said, for decades?
Sure. So we did inform ourselves with data. There's a really great research project I encourage everybody to look at from the University of Minnesota's Center for Urban and Regional Affairs that looks into gentrification and displacement in the Twin Cities. And they divided their work into two sides. They did a quantitative assessment. They used some of the commonly accepted methods for determining finding neighborhoods that are vulnerable to gentrification or where it's happening already, or specifically housing displacement. But then I think what was really innovative about what they did is Dr. Brittany Lewis did a qualitative assessment where she went around the city and interviewed people actually experiencing or fearing displacement. And what was really there was a lot that was interesting out of that qualitative work. One thing that really struck out for me is she said that in all of the people she interviewed, nobody said that the solution is to not invest in the neighborhood.
Yeah. Right.
People really want to see change happen in their neighborhoods. They just want it to be something that benefits them and their neighbors. So that was a message, to answer your question, that was a message that we carried forward in our work, is that we're leveling the playing field with a map, but that doesn't determine what your neighborhood looks like in the future.
Sheila, are there differences between how this question about who is community and neighborhood change plays out in Europe versus Latin America versus the United States, or is there a common thread?
I mean, I think it's so easy to romanticize community, right? And so, so yes and no. I mean, I think here in the U.S., race haunts us. So we always have to be kind of on the lookout for that issue and the way economics plays out. So I do think that these issues play out quite differently in different regions of the world. But I do think it's important it really is about the winners and losers at the end of the day, about vulnerable and non-vulnerable populations, and about how you include them and put them at the center of this work. I think at the end of the day, that's the same, right? Whether you're talking about new migrant communities in Bologna, the Africans that are coming over that live on the, or in the global South, informal settlements. I mean, that they're the ones that you need to bring into the process, or whether you're talking about core neighborhoods that are around, Midtown and downtown Detroit that aren't being included. Whatever it is, I think that the question's still the same, that who's on the margins that needs to be brought in.
So in a place like Harlem,
Yeah.
what does community definition look like?
Yeah, so this is really good. We have a project around broadband access in Harlem. New York City's a smart city, but 1 in 3 households don't have broadband access, right? And so in Harlem, what we're doing is creating a community-based broadband network with edge cloud technology. I won't get into the weeds of it, but Harlem has changed, like Washington has changed. What used to be a predominantly African-American community or city is now less so, right, and more affluent. But yet the people that are the most vulnerable amongst these changes still are minority populations. So so we're working, so community has changed in Harlem. Talk about the new and the old. The old guard is still there, but there's a whole new crop that's come in part because Columbia has expanded. A lot of the redevelopment of Harlem is such that that was unfortunately inevitable if you don't put things in place. So community's changing, but what's not changed is that we're still in designing this thing, working with the city and Silicon Harlem, the community-based organization that's doing a lot of work. You know, we're having meetings, convenings in NYCHA housing, in the public housing, right? And we're going to the places where the people who don't have access are and trying to figure out what they want out of this new network that's going to be connected to the larger network in to the smart city infrastructure in Harlem. So community is both the new community and old. Harlem has changed, but also the people, when I use community, in part, it's the people that you need to bring from the margins into the process. So I think these are tricky questions, obviously. I mean, no, we're not gonna, but it's identifying, you know, who you're trying to reach and to bring into the success of the city, basically, whether that's Detroit or, you know, New York City.
So we have a room full of experts. I know enough about the people in the room to know that they have really interesting things to say. So this will be the last all-panel question, and then we'll go to Q&A. Just to remind you, when you speak for Q&A, project a little bit and speak loudly. That makes it easier to capture on the audio, and it will help me, you know, hear to be able to, you know, present the question back. So it's a simple question with perhaps no simple answer, but what's the one thing that you want people to leave this room knowing? Paul, we'll start with you.
I'd like to leave everybody with a suggestion, which is to go back to your city and talk to your planners and just get some data and maps from them if you haven't done this already. Take a look at your history of redlining and other racially restrictive housing policies and find out how that has affected your city and what legacy of that remains today. It does look different in different cities. It doesn't look the same as it does in Minneapolis in every city around the country. And then just see start having that conversation if you haven't already and see where it takes you. It doesn't mean you could or should eliminate single-family zoning like Minneapolis did. I'm not an evangelist for that particular policy, but start that conversation with information and see where it takes you.
Anika.
Okay, so I guess the one thing would be to set a really, really big round table. I think that's probably one of the most important lessons that we've learned, that as many people as possible on your redevelopment and inclusive journey has to include absolutely everyone, even unusual suspects that you don't expect. Right now, our housing initiative is focused on renters. We have more renters in Detroit than we have homeowners in a single-family housing city. And our new partners that I'm convinced show up in a bus all together are property owners. These landlords, they show up to these meetings, they come to these meetings, they have a lot of questions. I think mostly they think that we're going to help them with their code violations. That's really what they want. But while we have their attention, really getting to them about housing policy, equitable renter and landlord relationships has been a critical lesson for all of us. So.
And does that also imply building in enough time?
That's right. It does, exactly, that you have to be able to be patient with this. I think those of us who work in this space are accustomed to how we work ordinarily, and we don't really take the time to explain to people who are new to this work how to actually work together on these issues. Yeah, it's important.
Good, good.
Sheila.
So I would say from the
Can you put your microphone on?
Yes, so from the perspective of those of us who go to work with communities, whether you're in the city or outside, I would say no matter how much you think you may know what you want to do or have ideas or what's going on in a particular place, be willing to listen and set it aside. I think I've seen this so many times that, the best laid plans, right? And I think that's the value of actually inclusion of voices and setting the table is really be willing to listen and to change course at any moment. And if you're willing to do that, I think that gets you trust in the communities and with other actors. But also, I think you end up better off in the end. I think you end up with something that you don't have to retract on at a late stage. So that's what I would say.
Great. So we have about 25 minutes for questions. Yes, but just a reminder that questions tend not to come in paragraph shape. Questions tend to be something that you can express in a single breath, maybe two. So
good.
just do keep that in mind when you are asking what is really, in fact, going to be a question. Julia, because I know you, and speak up when you ask the question.
Innovation and technology for the city of Boulder. First of all, good job getting anyone involved in the long-range planning. My actual question is, how do you know it's working? So one of the promises to the community around engagement and equity is that we'll come back to you with results. Long-range plans are often sort of hard to materialize in terms of concrete outcomes. So how do you communicate that it's working or that you're doing what you said you were going to do?
So for the audio and the rest of the room, the question is, how do you know it's working? Because one way that you maintain that integrity of relationship with citizens is to show them evidence, but a 20-year plan or a 50-year plan, right? Who's going to remember? So Paul, how do you know it's working?
Well, Anika talked earlier at the beginning about the importance of data and going back to the community to this question to show your progress. I think first and foremost, for those of us who work at the city, we have to be okay with the fact that we don't know what that answer is going to be. We don't know what that trend line is. We know where we want the trend line to go, but we don't know for sure which way it's going to go. So we have to be transparent about that and understand that it might not go the right direction. So what we are specifically doing is creating a space on our website where we're going to have a whole bunch of metrics to track progress against the goals that are in the plan. First and foremost, reducing or eliminating disparities. We're also working with a number of other institutions on long-term longitudinal research, looking at some of the specific policy prescriptions that are in the Minneapolis 2040 comprehensive plan to try to tease out the effects of individual policy changes on some of these outcomes. So we're working with the University of Minnesota, the University of Washington, the Minneapolis branch of the Federal Reserve that has an outreach and research arm on putting together a whole suite of research that we will be looking at. So,
Anika, how do you know you're doing a good job?
Well, how do I know that I'm doing it? I think maybe how do you know that the plan is effective is different than whether or not you're doing a good job. So one of the big mistakes that we're known for in the Detroit Strategic Framework is that there wasn't, because of and I wasn't there, so I'm sort of summarizing, because of the way the process, the timing of the process, the way the money fell out, the way the city the administration at the time changed and bankruptcy was looming, there wasn't an opportunity to go back to the community after we created the land use section of the framework, which was the most significant. And the 50-year framework was an alternative land use framework to be able to say, here's how we're categorizing whole parts of the city. Some of them should be used for open space, some of them should be used for redevelopment. And the map that was drawn was quite frankly, and I don't know if anyone, I ended up saying this one time on a panel, and the person who drew the map was in the audience. It was bad, but anyway, so if you're out there.
You've already
I don't mean
lived
to
through
be
it. It'll be okay.
insensitive, but it hurt a lot of people's feelings because they ended up drawing over in sort of green shading whole neighborhoods where people lived. And they didn't go back to the community to even explain what that meant. It didn't mean that we're coming to get your house and making you move. And it really meant that these are places where that are low density places that should remain low density, that we don't have to focus on the redevelopment here. And without having that conversation for years, that's going to be a part of our history. And for years, there are people who believe that the framework was really designed to move poor people. So the long range of that, on one side, is a great lesson for the importance of going back when you have a significant investment in planning. But on the other side of that is this push. We still believe that open space is valuable. It's a valuable investment in making cities great, especially cities that are disinvested. And how you have that conversation, I think, is how you know that you're doing the right thing.
Sheila.
So just quickly, data is absolutely important. I think it's, from the city perspective, I think it's important to be able to evaluate what you're doing. But process, right? This comes back to, can you set up an iterative process in which you build into the planning process all along the way some space for community feedback? And there's so much innovation on this. Like, it's shocking that more cities don't do this because it's always costly on the back end. It's so costly. Just from an efficiency standpoint, how do you build this stuff from the beginning so that you're getting that constant feedback, and then you won't have to have this written in your history? So that's what I would say, is that think about it from the outset, about how to create, again, long-term stewards of this stuff that are in the community, that'll keep you honest and also give you feedback.
Great. Next question. In the very back. Yep.
Hi, my name's Amr. I work with the D.C. Mayor's Office. Thank you all so much for being here and a great discussion. One question I have, when we talk about equity, there are some actors that ironically do stand to lose from equity, right? And they tend to be, those actors, those powers that be, that need to cede some of what they have so that everybody can share that. The single-family housing example is a great example of that. So I'm wondering, how do you go about engaging those actors specifically? What does that conversation look like? Is there a different approach? Is it all happening in the same space?
So Sheila, when I think about that, I want to bring that to you, particularly because you mentioned that Harlem has had a lot of change, and there may be some newcomers who would be less interested in some of these conversations, or if there are other cities where you can talk about that.
So I mentioned the incentive structure before, like that I don't always lead with equity because some people do think that they're going to be winners and losers. And first of all, I think that's right. If we're asking there to be more equitable sharing of resources, that does mean moving things around somewhat. So I think that's right. But in trying to pull actors together, I think you have to figure out where people's incentive to want to be involved is. And so whether it's a developer, a local business, or in Harlem, our case, Microsoft or whatever. So it's not so much the other community members. So in Harlem, it's not a redistribution of resources. It's just plugging people in to get more of what is. So sometimes that's it. It's just, what is it to you that there will be more people to participate in the economic regeneration of the city without impacting your bottom line? But in the case where, like single-family zoning, there is a loss, right, or there's somebody, then I think you have to really think hard how to bring those people in and what their incentive would be to give up a little, and what they might gain. I mean, so that's a very vague response, and it's very context-specific, but I think it's a real question, and I think it's all about the incentive structure when you bring people together to build a city. And how you include more people in the distribution of the goods. It is hard. There are some losers, but there aren't always losers, and it's important to figure out how people can really come together around that.
So Paul, you lived this day in and day out. How did it play out in Minneapolis?
Well, so part of the question that you asked was, do you have these conversations in the same space? And we did try that.
Yeah.
planners like to think that we can build consensus, and the goal at the end of a planning process is that everybody agrees and links arms and says a job well done. I wish I could say that was the end result of our process. It wasn't. We did attempt to have those conversations in the same place, in the same space, with lots of different types of people. People really held their ground in those forums. We did all this creative engagement that I didn't really talk about. We hired artists to design and implement our big open house type engagement opportunities. So people were able to express their ideas through poetry and art and a mock TV show and all these kind of creative ways of bringing people into what is normally a boring bureaucratic process. And that really generated a lot of rich input. Despite all of that creative engagement, at the end of the day, at the end of the process, we did have almost every member of our 13-member city council ask us to come do a town hall style forum in their ward, something you would see Leslie Knope do in Parks and Recreation. So we sat up there at the table and got yelled at. That was the opportunity for the people who already had agency to come make their voices heard, and that was just kind of an outlet. So it's a long way of getting to, at the end of the day, the council just had to make a decision and decide where they were going to go based on that, and it was a 12-to-1 vote to go with the approach we put out there.
Anika, is this something that comes up in your, not so much?
Not so much, yeah. Soon.
Yeah, right.
But what's interesting about this discussion, right, is how much emotion comes up, right? We talk about fear, we talk about anger, in what we might like to think is a rational process of land use planning, but I think all policy actually has deep emotion inside it, and perhaps the more that we can just be honest about the deep emotion and give people a container for releasing that deep emotion, may be good. I mean, I'm not going to be on the front lines of that, but I can encourage all of you to be so. Another question, yeah, gentleman with the glasses, and then I'll get you, David.
Hi, sorry. I'm Stéphane. My name. I come from Paris, and I've got a question for you, Sheila, because it seems that your concept of co-cities is very connected to commons.
Yes, based in the commons.
Yeah. So I don't want to open the debate about commons
That's
today,
right. Okay,
but
thank
we try to develop the same in France, and
Yeah.
we see that it's quite difficult for people to understand what is it exactly. Can you give us one reason why commons is so important for you in the American context, for instance, in cities? Can you just give one reason why we should be caring about that?
So you've noticed I haven't used the word.
So
Yeah,
can you,
that was my idea.
Yes, yes. All right. So the idea of the commons, right? So, and the CoCity is based on the idea of the commons, and I've written an article, "The City as a Commons." And what I mean by that, and it has resonance in Europe, not in Paris, but certainly Italy and Spain and other countries, is that it's our collective resource. Right? If you think about the commons, you think about our natural resources. You know, we've heard the tragedy of the commons. Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for finding instances of community-run commons. And so I brought it into cities to say that, you know, as cities are places where most of us live and we generate most of our economic productivity, this is a resource that we have, that it's a collective resource. How do we share it? So to me, that's the idea. But it's such a fraught concept, and Americans don't get it like some Europeans say. So I don't use it here, but it's used very much in Italy because there was a commons movement. The mayor of Barcelona comes out of a commons movement, so it's much more known. Here I don't use it because people think communism. So, and none of us want to be socialists, right, or communists. So I can't say much about Paris, but so I don't use it here. We use the CoCity, which is embedded in the concept of the commons.
Great. David, who've been waiting patiently, and the microphone is coming there.
David Garcia, UC Berkeley Turner Center for Housing Innovation. My question is kind of the inverse of what we heard 2 questions ago, in that in California, we're having this conversation now about land use reform, and we're hearing from a lot of communities that actually single-family zoning kind of protects me, because if it was to be rezoned, there may be value that is added, and then the landlord doesn't see me as part of that value. And so my question really is for Sheila. You mentioned something earlier, but I'm interested in the whole panel's perspective on this. What are the strategies that can and should be part of this discussion to help ensure that any land use reforms are not unintentionally pushing people out of communities as they attract investment and change?
Right. So, Anika said something important, which is to say that everything built in Detroit has a subsidy. That was so important, and that struck me because if you understand, as we all do, how cities are developing and that they're very dependent upon mobile capital, like Amazon and others, or Dan Gilbert, and that they're attracting that through tax write-offs and subsidies. It's important to understand that cities have at their disposal mechanisms to not just subsidize development, but subsidize affordability. And it's more than just market rate affordability as an inclusionary zoning. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about renter protection. New York State just passed a bill. I'm talking about enabling land trust in limited equity housing, in ways that you create residents in cities, that you give them a stake in the commons, right? In our collective resource, which is the city. Right? And so I don't use a but the idea is, how do you keep you don't have to keep everyone in place. I mean, there has to be room for neighborhood change and for cities to develop, but how do you create mechanisms that not just subsidize high-end development, not just subsidize inclusionary zoning, which is not really affordable, but actually subsidize people creating something in their community using vacant land, which I think is in the commons, our land, our collective resource, to create diverse, inclusive communities. And so I'm a lawyer, and I think it's important, just to plug for the lawyers, to know that we have these tools. And a lot of the innovation that we're engaged in is legal. It is taking the variety of laws and policies and creating new ones, because cities have this power. Cities don't have a lot of power, but they do have this power. And so I'm not going to go into the weeds now, but that's a lot of, and so as part of our CoCities work, we've mapped over 100 cities and 500 policies and projects within them to identify some of the best practices around the world on this. And so that's partly, it's all going to come out in our book on the CoCity, plug for the book, MIT Press. But because I'm trying to understand this myself, how to drive this kind of inclusive innovation from a policy perspective.
I think, I'm a California kid. I grew up in Oakland. So I am shocked and dismayed at what's happened to my city, but from that perspective, I think somewhere along the way, as Southern California, because I also, for years, I was the vice president at LISC, and spent a lot of time very deeply in housing and worked in Los Angeles in community development to try to help them figure some of that out in California. And what struck me was that there aren't these kinds of really simple, they're not simple, they're actually very complicated, tools that create affordability that the rest of the country is relying on, and it's okay. And I don't know if this has become, I will say there's a lot of money in housing, whether it's affordable housing or whether it's market rate housing in California in general, right? And maybe that is part of the problem. One of the issues that we're dealing with in Detroit, and I don't know for sure that that's the problem, so don't go back to California and tell everybody. My aunts and uncles will be very disappointed. But I know one of the issues that we're dealing with in Detroit, as we continue to talk about, we use the term equity a lot, because people are feeling there's a sense of empowerment to be able to use equity. But we're also finding that there are inequities within the systems that we don't expect. So within the community development organizations there are some CDCs that for no apparent reason, they're not building any more units or starting any new businesses more than anybody else, but they might be getting $300,000 a year from philanthropy. And then another community-based organization is getting $50,000 a year from philanthropy, and they pretty much think they're doing the same thing. And so having that hard conversation about equity internally in a system that's supposed to be working on equity is a really hard conversation to have. But, and this isn't the answer to your question at all, because this is a crisis in California right now. But this idea of political will and how do you actually, it's a combination of actually redistributing wealth in a place that can actually generate housing so that it's a place where people want to live, opportunity for everyone, which I can't quite understand why you wouldn't want to be that city. Why wouldn't San Francisco want to be a place that's an opportunity for everybody, right? I can't quite figure that out, but I do know that having that hard conversation about where there are real inequities inside the system is something that might be that you might have to deal with.
So Paul, just to bring us back to the point though around because this has been productive, but I think I think David's original question was a powerful one, which is planners and others have tried to do good and have ended up doing not good. So how do you foresee or create buffers against the unintended consequences whereby, yeah, if somebody can now put up a multifamily building, maybe they will be a little aggressive with a tenant in a single family place because suddenly that's three sales opportunities they might have.
So the way it's often done in cities that are facing housing shortages is, I think to David's example is, well, let's look at this one part of the city and let's upzone this one part of the city. And when you do that, yeah, that's where the development's going to happen. That's where the developers can come in and tear stuff down and build new stuff and displace people. So that's why I think a citywide approach is really important. I mean, ideally region-wide or whatever your housing market is. In Minneapolis, we can control what happens within our city boundaries, so that's what we're doing. But if you do it citywide, at least our hope is that will help kind of keep that at bay. The hot submarkets within the city will not be constrained, and so that they can continue, the development can continue to happen there and not spill over into places where it's less desired.
So in a way, a kind of or a level playing field actually in that sense can support equity because you're not targeting all of the development interest in one place.
Right.
Great. We have room for one more question. Yep. Or time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Tamara Lindsay. I'm with the Cities for Financial Empowerment Fund. So we work with cities on embedding financial empowerment initiatives and with mayors. So my question is, either the three of you, how do you get this kind of traction within city government so that you're not siloed? How you really get, because it sounds, Paul, like you got a lot of backing to be able to go do this process. What's the messaging internally to get to the mayor, to get to the city chief of staff, to keep this front and center?
And I think because we are standing between people and lunch, I'll ask for like a top line thing, and then we can, have a long the long conversation that this deserves maybe after the panel. But sort of top line, how do you get that buy-in and keep it front and center?
Two quick things. One, we already talked about data, but I'll just reinforce it. Bring data to your elected officials, show it to them, that'll motivate them. And two, bring them people in your community who care about this, because that's who they answer to.
Right. Exactly. Philanthropy plays a big role, and it can be very, very influential to local elected officials also.
Yeah, I agree. So we try to find the entry point in cities, and it could be an agency, it could be a project, so redevelopment agency of Baton Rouge, the Department of Technology in New York City, which Jose was part of, someone who's already there who wants to do equity. And you're bringing them a tool, and then it kind of, once you show it, I do believe in scaling, you do something powerful if you don't have a foundation or the big actor that brings money, but one way in is just to do something powerful on a scale that matters, in one part of the city government, particularly if the city government is big, but even if it isn't, just one, we're always looking for the entry point into the city. Need not be at the mayor, right? Even if the mayor's not thinking, just where's the entry point? So that's why I figure out the entry point in cities for this work.
Great. So normally I try to do some kind of summary at the end of the panel. I think we've defied summary because we have covered so many different issues and realms, but I think that that's why land use is complicated and compelling, because so many things land, no pun intended, but tend to land there, right? There's emotion, there's financial health of individuals, there's financial health of the city. When I went to law school, in my application, I wrote, I want to go to law school because you have 2,000 years of political philosophy embedded in your zoning code. And I think that we have kind of brought that out today, why this is such a compelling and complex issue. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you at the rest of CityLab.